They thought she was just another civilian getting in the way of a military operation, until a 2-star general spotted the tattoo on her wrist and realized the woman treating crash victims was the spy everyone believed had died in Beirut 7 years ago. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning fog hung thick over Interstate 94 as Dr. Sarah Chen guided her aging Honda Civic through the pre-dawn darkness toward Mercy General Hospital. At 34, she had developed the kind of steady composure that came from years of emergency medicine, though most people saw only a quiet woman who preferred the night shift because it meant fewer questions and less small talk. Her thermos of coffee sat cooling in the cup holder, forgotten as she mentally prepared for another 12-hour rotation in the trauma bay. Sarah had chosen emergency medicine precisely because it allowed her to help people without forming lasting connections. Patients came and went, grateful for her skilled hands and calm demeanor, but rarely staying long enough to probe into her background or wonder why someone with her obvious surgical precision was working at a mid-tier hospital in suburban Michigan instead of pursuing a prestigious residency at Johns Hopkins or Mayo Clinic. She preferred it that way. Anonymity was a luxury she had learned to value above all else. The radio crackled with morning traffic reports as Sarah navigated the familiar route past strip malls and fast food restaurants. This stretch of highway connected 3 military installations, which meant the hospital saw its share of service members and their families. But Sarah had grown skilled at maintaining professional distance, even when treating soldiers whose bearing and discipline reminded her of a life she had worked desperately to leave behind. 7 years of building this careful, ordinary existence had taught her that the past could be buried if you were disciplined. Enough about living quietly in the present. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez, the attending physician she would be relieving. Slow night. 2 domestic violence cases, 1 overdose, standard Friday inventory. Coffee is fresh. Sarah smiled slightly at his attempt at humor. Roberto Martinez was one of the few colleagues who had stopped trying to invite her to staff parties or casual drinks after work. He respected her boundaries in a way that made their professional relationship comfortable without being personal. The highway curved past Lake Henderson, its surface mirror smooth in the early morning calm. Sarah had driven this route nearly every day for 3 years, ever since taking the position at Mercy General, but she still felt a small surge of gratitude each time she saw the lake. After years of scorching deserts and concrete compounds, the Michigan landscape felt like a gift she had never expected to receive. Green trees, clean water, and the kind of peaceful predictability that she had once thought was meant for other people, she had told the hospital administrator during her interview that she had burned out from a high-pressure residency in Chicago and was looking for a slower pace to rediscover her passion for medicine. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had burned out, though not from medical training, and she was definitely seeking a slower pace, though for reasons that had nothing to do with career satisfaction. The administrator had been impressed by her test scores and clinical references, never questioning why someone with her qualifications would settle for a position that paid significantly less than what she could earn in a major metropolitan area. Sarah's apartment was a 15-minute drive from the hospital, close enough for emergency calls, but far enough to maintain separation between her work life and the careful solitude she had constructed at home. She lived alone in a converted warehouse loft, surrounded by medical textbooks and surgical journals that she studied obsessively, partly to stay current in her field and partly because focusing on anatomy and pathology kept her mind from wandering to subjects that still caused her hands to shake. The coffee shop where she stopped each morning was staffed by a rotating crew of college students who had learned to have her large black coffee ready when she walked through the door at 5:47 a.m. They called her Doc and sometimes asked about particularly gruesome injuries they had seen on medical dramas, but their curiosity was casual and temporary, lasting only as long as their part-time jobs. Sarah appreciated their friendly indifference, the way they treated her as a regular customer without expecting her to share personal details or build lasting friendships. Her Honda needed new brake pads and probably a transmission service, but Sarah had learned to be cautious about spending money on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. The modest salary from her hospital job was enough to cover rent, food, and the basic necessities of a quiet life, but she avoided any purchases that might require background checks or financial scrutiny. She paid for everything in cash when possible, maintained only the credit history necessary to rent an apartment and keep utilities connected, and had grown skilled at the kind of financial invisibility that kept bureaucratic attention to a minimum. 3 blocks from the hospital, Sarah passed the military surplus store where she sometimes bought practical clothing, cargo pants with useful pockets, sturdy boots that could withstand long shifts on her feet, and the occasional jacket when Michigan winters proved colder than expected. The store owner was a Vietnam veteran who asked fewer questions than most retail clerks, accepting cash payments and maintaining the kind of professional courtesy that suggested he understood something about wanting to be left alone. The hospital parking garage was nearly empty at this hour, with only a few scattered vehicles belonging to night shift staff and early arriving residents. Sarah parked in her usual spot on the 3rd level, gathered her leather messenger bag containing stethoscope, reflex hammer, and the small collection of emergency supplies she kept maintained out of habit, and made her way toward the elevator. The ritual of checking her equipment had become automatic over the years, though she was careful never to carry anything that might raise questions about why an emergency physician needed tools that weren't standard hospital issue. As she walked through the corridor toward the trauma bay, Sarah reflected on how successfully she had constructed this life of helpful anonymity. Her colleagues respected her clinical skills and relied on her steady presence during difficult cases, but none of them knew about the languages she spoke fluently, the countries she had lived in, or the reasons why she sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning with her heart racing and her hands reaching for weapons that were no longer there. She had become exactly what she had hoped to become: competent, reliable, and completely forgettable. The trauma bay was quiet when she arrived, with only one patient sleeping off a minor alcohol-related injury in bed 3. Dr. Martinez was completing paperwork at the central station, his usually energetic demeanor subdued by the long night shift. "All yours," he said, handing her the patient files. "Mrs. Johnson in 3 should be ready for discharge as soon as she sobers up enough to call someone for a ride. Everything else is handled." Sarah settled into the familiar rhythm of checking patient charts, reviewing inventory, and preparing for whatever emergencies might arrive during her shift. Emergency medicine had turned out to be an ideal profession for someone who needed to help people while maintaining emotional distance. The work was demanding enough to occupy her full attention, preventing her mind from drifting to subjects she preferred not to remember, but flexible enough to allow her the solitude she required between cases. The first call came at 6:23 a.m., just as the morning shift was settling into routine. "Multi-vehicle accident on I-94 near the Whitmore exit," the dispatch operator reported. "Military convoy involved. Multiple casualties, unknown severity. All available units responding." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency calls, gathering her equipment and heading toward the ambulance bay, where paramedics would soon be arriving with injured people who needed her help. What she didn't know, as she prepared to leave the safety of Mercy General Hospital, was that this particular accident would shatter the careful anonymity she had spent 7 years constructing, bringing her face to face with people from a world she thought she had left behind forever. The accident scene on Interstate 94 looked like a war zone when Sarah arrived in the passenger seat of the ambulance. 3 civilian vehicles had collided with a military convoy during the morning fog. creating a twisted maze of metal and glass that stretched across both eastbound lanes. Emergency vehicles lined the shoulder with their lights painting the gray dawn in urgent reds and blues, while state troopers worked to redirect traffic around the massive cleanup operation. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and jumped down from the ambulance before it had completely stopped, her trained eyes immediately scanning the scene for the most critical casualties. 2 paramedics were already working on an elderly man near the guardrail, while firefighters used hydraulic tools to extract someone from a crushed sedan. The sharp smell of gasoline mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke rising from one of the military vehicles that had caught fire after impact. "We've got at least 6 wounded," shouted Lieutenant Morrison, a military police officer who was coordinating the emergency response. 3 civilians from the cars, 3 soldiers from the convoy. The worst injuries are over there. He pointed toward a military Humvee that had flipped onto its side, its olive green paint scraped away to reveal bare metal. Underneath. Sarah moved toward the overturned vehicle where she could hear someone calling for help in a voice tight with pain. As she approached, she saw a young soldier trapped beneath the wreckage, his left leg pinned at an unnatural angle, while blood pooled beneath him from injuries she couldn't yet assess. His uniform identified him as Private Williams, and despite his obvious pain, he was trying to maintain the disciplined composure that military training had drilled into him. "I'm Dr. Chen," Sarah said, dropping to her knees beside the trapped soldier and immediately beginning her assessment. "I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay as still as possible while I figure out what we're dealing with." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking his pulse, examining his pupils for signs of head trauma, and carefully probing around the pinned leg to determine the extent of the injury. Private Williams had sustained a compound fracture of his left femur, with the broken bone visible through a tear in his uniform pants. The bleeding was significant, but not immediately life-threatening if she could stabilize him properly. More concerning was the possibility of internal injuries from the impact, which would require careful monitoring and immediate transport to a hospital with full surgical capabilities. "Ma'am, you need to step back," said a voice behind her. Sarah looked up to see a military medic approaching with his own equipment bag, his expression suggesting that he didn't appreciate civilian interference in what he considered a military matter. "We'll handle our personnel. You can work on the civilians. He needs immediate intervention for a compound femur fracture," Sarah replied, not moving from her position beside the injured soldier. "The bleeding needs to be controlled before he can be moved, and there's a risk of shock from blood loss." She had already begun applying pressure to the wound with gauze from her kit, her movements precise and confident, despite the chaos around them. The military medic, whose name tape read Sergeant Foster, stepped closer with obvious irritation. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a military casualty on a military convoy. We have protocols for handling our own wounded, and those protocols don't include civilian medical personnel." His tone was polite but firm, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Sarah looked up at Sergeant Foster while maintaining pressure on Private Williams's wound. "Your protocols don't override medical necessity," she said calmly. "This soldier has lost approximately 800 milliliters of blood and is showing early signs of shock. Moving him without proper stabilization could cause additional injury to the femoral artery and potentially result in death from blood loss." "Doctor, I understand you want to help," Foster replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "But you need to understand that military personnel are treated by military medical staff. That's not negotiable." He gestured toward a group of civilians who were being treated near the guardrail. "There are plenty of people over there who need your attention." The standoff might have continued, but Private Williams chose that moment to lose consciousness, his body going limp as his blood pressure dropped below the threshold needed to maintain brain function. Sarah immediately shifted into emergency mode, checking his airway and preparing to establish an 4 line to restore fluid volume and blood pressure. "He's going into shock," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "I need lactated Ringer's solution and a 16-gauge 4 catheter immediately." She was all ready, palpating Williams's wrist to locate a vein suitable for 4 access, her movements swift and precise despite the difficult conditions. Sergeant Foster hesitated, clearly torn between his orders to maintain control over military casualties and the obvious medical crisis developing in front of him. "Ma'am, you really need to step back and let us handle this," he said, though his protest sounded less confident than before. Sarah ignored him, focused entirely on establishing 4 access while simultaneously monitoring Private Williams's vital signs. She had inserted the catheter and was connecting the 4 tubing when she heard heavy footsteps approaching from behind. "What's the situation here?" demanded a new voice, this one carrying the unmistakable tone of senior military authority. "Sir, we have a civilian doctor who's refusing to follow protocol," Sergeant Foster reported. "She's treating military personnel without authorization." The relief in his voice was obvious as he transferred responsibility for the situation to someone with higher rank and greater authority to resolve the conflict. Sarah looked up briefly to see a tall man in military fatigues with colonel's eagles on his collar, but her primary attention remained on Private Williams, whose blood pressure was slowly stabilizing as the 4 fluids began to take effect. "Colonel, this soldier needs immediate surgical intervention," she said without stopping her work. "The fracture has damaged the femoral artery, and there's significant internal bleeding that won't respond to field treatment." Colonel Patterson studied the scene for a moment, taking in Sarah's confident handling of the medical emergency and the obvious improvement in the soldier's condition since she had begun treatment. "Doctor, what's your assessment of his chances if we transport him immediately versus waiting for our medical team to arrive?" "Immediate transport gives him an 80% chance of full recovery," Sarah replied, adjusting the 4 flow rate to maintain optimal blood pressure. "Waiting for additional medical personnel increases the risk of permanent nerve damage and possible amputation due to prolonged blood loss and tissue death." Her clinical assessment was delivered in the matter-of-fact tone that emergency physicians used when discussing life-threatening situations. Colonel Patterson nodded slowly, clearly weighing military protocol against medical necessity. "Sergeant Foster, coordinate with the civilian paramedics for immediate transport," he ordered. "This soldier's life takes priority over bureaucratic procedures." The decision clearly didn't come easily, but his commitment to the welfare of his personnel overrode his concerns about protocol violations. As the paramedics prepared Private Williams for transport to Mercy General Hospital, Sarah began gathering her equipment and preparing to treat other casualties at the scene. She had started to move toward the civilian vehicles when she noticed someone else watching her from beside one of the military command vehicles. Unlike the other personnel at the accident scene, this observer wasn't participating in the emergency response, but rather studying her with the kind of focused attention that made her uncomfortable. The man was older than the other military personnel, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. His uniform displayed general stars, and something about his posture suggested that he had seen combat in places where quick thinking and decisive action meant the difference between life and death. What concerned Sarah was the way he was looking at her, as though he was trying to solve a puzzle or recall something important. General Harrison had arrived at the accident scene to check on his personnel and assess the damage to the convoy. But his attention had been captured by the civilian doctor who had just saved one of his soldiers. There was something familiar about her movements, something about the way she handled the medical emergency that reminded him of someone he had known in a very different context many years ago. Sarah felt the general's scrutiny as she knelt beside The next casualty, a civilian woman with a possible concussion from the collision. She forced herself to focus on the patient's pupils and neurological responses, but she could feel her heart rate increasing with the uncomfortable awareness that someone was paying too much attention to her actions and her presence at the accident. Seeing Dot as she worked to stabilize the injured woman, Sarah's long sleeves began to ride up from the repeated motions of checking vital signs and adjusting medical equipment. She was too focused on her patient to notice when the fabric pulled back far enough to reveal the edge of a small tattoo on her right wrist, a mark that she had kept carefully hidden for 7 years. General Harrison saw the tattoo when Sarah reached across the patient to check her pulse, and his blood went cold as recognition hit him like a physical blow. The tattoo was barely visible beneath Sarah's sleeve, just a glimpse of intricate black ink that most people would dismiss as decorative artwork. But General Harrison knew exactly what those symbols meant, and seeing them on the wrist of a civilian doctor at a highway accident scene made his hands tremble as memories he had tried to bury came flooding back with devastating clarity. 3 interlocking circles with a small star in the center, surrounded by numbers that looked random to untrained eyes but represented coordinates that Harrison had memorized during sleepless nights in Beirut. It was the identifying mark of Operation Nightingale, a classified intelligence mission that had officially never existed and had supposedly ended with the death of all personnel involved when their safe house was bombed by enemy operatives 7 years ago. Sarah continued working on the civilian patient, completely unaware that her carefully guarded secret had been exposed by something as simple as fabric shifting during medical treatment. She was checking the woman's neurological responses when she felt someone approach from behind. The heavy footsteps and controlled breathing pattern suggesting military training and senior rank. "Doctor," General Harrison said, his voice carefully controlled despite the shock that was coursing through his system. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment when you're finished with your patient." The words were phrased as a request, but Sarah recognized the tone of authority that expected compliance without question. She looked up briefly, noting the general's intense focus on her face, as though he was comparing her features to some mental image he had been carrying for years. "I'll be available once all casualties have been stabilized and transported," she replied, returning her attention to the injured woman while fighting the growing unease that was building in her chest. General Harrison stepped back but didn't leave, positioning himself where he could observe Sarah's work while making discreet phone calls on his encrypted military communication device. She could hear fragments of his conversations over the noise of emergency vehicles and rescue operations. Words like confirmation, classified database, and immediate verification that sent cold fear racing through her nervous system. Civilian patient showed signs of a mild concussion but no life-threatening injuries, so Sarah carefully transferred her care to a paramedic team and moved toward the final casualty, a soldier who had been thrown clear of his vehicle during the impact. As she worked, she became increasingly aware that General Harrison was documenting her actions, speaking quietly into his phone while maintaining visual contact with her at all times. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had sustained multiple lacerations and a possible shoulder separation when he was ejected from the military vehicle, but he was conscious and alert enough to follow Sarah's instructions as she assessed his injuries. "Thank you, ma'am," he said as she cleaned the cuts on his arms. "Doc Foster was tied up with the other casualties, and I was starting to think nobody was going to get to me." "Everyone gets treated," Sarah replied automatically, though her mind was racing with concern about the general's obvious interest in her identity and background. "You're going to need x-rays of that shoulder, but the cuts are superficial and should heal without complications." She was applying antiseptic to his wounds when she realized that General Harrison had moved closer and was now standing directly behind her. "Your technique is very sophisticated for civilian emergency medicine," Harrison observed, his voice carrying undertones that suggested the comment was more than casual conversation. Have you had advanced trauma training beyond what's typical for hospital physicians? The question seemed innocent enough, but Sarah detected the probing quality that indicated he was fishing for specific information. I completed my residency in emergency medicine at a busy urban hospital, Sarah answered carefully, not looking up from her work on Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Trauma cases were a regular part of the training. It was technically true, though. She was omitting the additional specialized training she had received in military, field medicine, and combat casualty care during her years in intelligence operations. General Harrison moved to where he could see her face more clearly. Which hospital was that? He asked, his tone becoming more direct and less conversational. I'm always interested in hearing about programs that produce physicians with your level of skill under emergency conditions. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she realized the general was conducting an informal interrogation disguised as professional. Interest: University of Chicago Medical Center, she replied, which was true as far as it went. She had completed a legitimate emergency medicine residency there after leaving intelligence work, though she was hoping he wouldn't probe deeper into the timeline or ask for details about her background before medical school. Chicago, Harrison repeated thoughtfully, as though filing the information away for later verification. Excellent program. I'm sure they were fortunate to have someone with your obvious aptitude for emergency medicine. He paused, studying her profile as she worked. Tell me, Dr. Chen, have you ever done medical work in international settings? Humanitarian missions, perhaps, or consulting work overseas? The question hit too close to home, and Sarah felt her hands pause momentarily before resuming their work on the soldier's injuries. No, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. I've worked exclusively in domestic hospital settings since completing my training. Another technical truth that omitted 7 years of medical cover work in Middle Eastern conflict zones. General Harrison noticed the slight hesitation in her movements and the way her shoulders tensed when he mentioned international work. Combined with the tattoo he had glimpsed and her exceptional trauma skills, these small reactions were building a picture that confirmed his growing suspicions about her true identity. Interesting, he said, pulling out his phone again. Excuse me for a moment, Doctor. I need to make another call about logistics for transporting our wounded personnel. He stepped away, but remained close enough to monitor her actions while speaking quietly into his secure communication device. Sarah finished treating Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and helped transfer him to a waiting ambulance, but she could feel General Harrison's attention like a weight on her shoulders. Every movement felt scrutinized, every word analyzed for hidden meaning. She had survived 7 years of careful anonymity only to have it potentially unraveled by a highway accident and a moment of careless sleeve positioning. As the last casualties were loaded into ambulances and transported to nearby hospitals, the accident scene began to clear of emergency vehicles. State troopers were reopening traffic lanes while military personnel worked to recover their damaged vehicles and secure any sensitive equipment that might have been exposed during the crash. General Harrison finished his phone calls and approached Sarah as she was packing her medical equipment back into her kit. Dr. Chen, he said, I wonder if you might have a few minutes to discuss something with me privately. There's a matter of mutual interest that I'd like to explore. Sarah's heart rate spiked as she realized this was the conversation she had been dreading. I need to return to the hospital, she said, checking her watch to emphasize the urgency. My shift is still ongoing, and they'll be expecting me to help treat the casualties when they arrive at Mercy General. Of course, Harrison replied smoothly. Perhaps we could continue our conversation there. I'd like to personally ensure that our wounded personnel receive the best possible care, and you've already demonstrated exceptional skill in treating them. His words were reasonable on the surface, but Sarah understood that this wasn't really a request. As she climbed back into the ambulance for the return trip to Mercy General Hospital, Sarah caught sight of General Harrison getting into a black military sedan that would obviously be following them. She tried to convince herself that his interest might be nothing more than professional courtesy or standard military procedure for checking on wounded personnel. But the intensity of his focus and the specific nature of his questions suggested something far more concerning. During the 20-minute drive back to the hospital, Sarah's mind raced through possible scenarios and responses. If General Harrison had somehow connected her to Operation Nightingale, she would need to decide whether to maintain her cover story or acknowledge her past, and hope that enough time had passed for the classified restrictions to have been lifted. Problem was that Operation Nightingale had been so deeply classified that even acknowledging her involvement could violate federal laws about intelligence activities. The mission had been designed with such strict compartmentalization that most participants knew only their specific roles, not the broader objectives or outcomes. Sarah had spent the last 7 years believing that she was the only survivor of the Beirut bombing that had supposedly killed the entire Nightingale team. If General Harrison knew about the operation and recognized her tattoo, it meant that either she had been wrong about being the sole survivor or that someone in military intelligence had been tracking her despite her careful efforts to disappear into civilian life. As the ambulance pulled into the Mercy General Hospital emergency bay, Sarah saw the black sedan parking in a visitor space near the main entrance. General Harrison emerged from the vehicle and stood watching as she gathered her equipment, his posture suggesting patience but determination. Whatever he wanted to discuss, he wasn't going away until he got the answers he was seeking. Sarah realized that the quiet, anonymous life she had built so carefully was about to be tested in ways she had never anticipated. The trauma bay at Mercy General Hospital buzzed with controlled urgency as the casualties from the highway accident began arriving. Sarah threw herself into the familiar rhythm of emergency medicine, hoping that the demands of treating critically injured patients would force General Harrison to delay whatever confrontation he had planned. She knew it was only a temporary reprieve, but every minute of normalcy felt precious when her carefully constructed life was threatening to unravel. Private Williams arrived first, his condition stabilized but still requiring immediate surgical intervention for the compound femur fracture. Sarah worked alongside Dr. Martinez and the surgical team to prepare him for emergency surgery, her hands steady despite the knowledge that General Harrison was somewhere in the hospital watching her every move. The young soldier had regained consciousness during transport and was asking about his fellow convoy members with the kind of loyalty that reminded Sarah why she had once been willing to risk everything for people who wore the same uniform. Dr. Chen called Nurse Patricia Webb from the reception desk. "There's a General Harrison here asking to speak with you about the accident casualties. He says it's regarding military protocol for treatment of service members." Patricia's expression suggested she found the request unusual but not necessarily alarming, though Sarah detected the curiosity that came when military officials appeared unexpectedly in civilian medical facilities. Sarah nodded, while continuing to monitor Private Williams's vital signs. "Tell the General I'll be available to discuss his personnel once they're all stabilized and receiving appropriate care," she replied, hoping to buy more time before the inevitable conversation. Medical treatment takes priority over administrative concerns. General Harrison appeared in the trauma bay doorway 15 minutes later, his presence commanding immediate attention from the hospital staff, who weren't accustomed to high-ranking military officials observing their work. He positioned himself where he could watch Sarah's interactions with the wounded soldiers while maintaining enough distance to avoid interfering with medical procedures. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was conscious and alert when his ambulance arrived, his shoulder injury requiring X-rays and possible orthopedic consultation, but not immediately life-threatening. As Sarah examined his range of motion and checked for nerve damage, she could feel General Harrison's intense scrutiny of her diagnostic techniques and patient interaction style. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said as Sarah tested his shoulder mobility, "I wanted to thank you again for taking care of us out there. Doc Foster told me you probably saved Williams's life with that quick forework." His gratitude was genuine, but Sarah noticed how General Harrison leaned forward slightly when the soldier praised her advanced trauma skills. "Just doing my job," Sarah replied, though she was acutely aware that her job description as a civilian emergency physician didn't typically include the kind of field medicine she had performed at the accident scene. "You're going to need physical therapy for that shoulder, but you should regain full function within 6 to 8 weeks. The third military casualty, Corporal Jackson, had sustained a concussion and multiple contusions, but was in stable condition when he arrived at the hospital. As Sarah conducted her neurological assessment, checking his pupils and cognitive responses, she noticed General Harrison taking notes on what appeared to be a military incident report form. "Doctor," General Harrison said, approaching the treatment area where Sarah was working, "I'd like to commend you for the exceptional care you provided to our personnel today. Your quick thinking and advanced trauma management quite possibly saved lives." His words were complimentary, but his tone carried undertones that suggested this was the opening to a much more significant conversation. Sarah looked up from her patient charts, meeting General Harrison's gaze directly for the first time since the accident scene. His eyes were sharp and calculating, studying her facial features with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was comparing her appearance to photographs or descriptions he had memorized. "Thank you, General. I'm glad I could help." "Your techniques were quite sophisticated," Harrison continued, stepping closer to the treatment station. "The way you handled the compound fracture, your assessment of shock symptoms, your fore-insertion under difficult field conditions, that level of expertise suggests training beyond standard civilian emergency medicine." His observation was phrased as a compliment, but Sarah recognized it as an interrogation technique designed to elicit information about her background. "Emergency medicine requires rapid decision-making and advanced trauma skills," Sarah replied carefully. "We train extensively in procedures that can stabilize critically injured patients under adverse conditions." She was choosing her words deliberately, providing accurate information while avoiding any details that might reveal her military medical training. General Harrison nodded thoughtfully, pulling out his phone to check what appeared to be a message or email. "Dr. Chen, I wonder if we might continue this conversation in a more private setting. There are some administrative details about today's incident that I'd like to discuss with you." The request was polite, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to having his wishes accommodated. Sarah glanced around the busy trauma bay, where other medical staff were treating civilian casualties from the accident and managing the regular flow of emergency cases. "I have other patients to see," she said, indicating the treatment areas where people were waiting for medical attention. "Perhaps we could schedule a meeting for later when my shift ends. I'm afraid this matter requires more immediate attention." Harrison replied, his tone becoming more direct. "It concerns the welfare of military personnel under my command, and I have reason to believe you may have information that's relevant to their safety and security." The shift in his language from administrative courtesy to military urgency was subtle but unmistakable. Dr. Martinez approached from the direction of the surgical suites, still wearing his scrubs from Private Williams's emergency operation. "Sarah, the surgery went well," he reported. "Clean repair of the femoral fracture, no complications with the arterial damage. The patient should make a full recovery." He paused, noticing General Harrison's presence. "Is everything all right here?" General Harrison was asking about our treatment protocols for military casualties. Sarah explained, hoping her colleague's presence might defer the private conversation that she was increasingly desperate to avoid. "I was explaining that we follow standard emergency medicine procedures regardless of the patient's military status." General Harrison studied the interaction between Sarah and Dr. Martinez, noting the easy professional relationship and the way Martinez seemed protective of his colleague. "Dr. Martinez, I assume? I understand you worked with Dr. Chen to treat our wounded personnel. I'd like to express the Army's gratitude for the exceptional care they received. Dr. Chen did most of the critical work at the accident scene," Martinez replied. "By the time the casualties reached us here, she had already stabilized the most seriously injured soldier and probably prevented permanent disability or worse." His praise was honest but had the unintended effect of further highlighting Sarah's advanced trauma capabilities. "Impressive," Harrison said, his attention returning to Sarah with renewed intensity. "Tell me, Dr. Chen, where did you develop such advanced field medicine skills? Your performance today suggests training that goes well beyond standard hospital emergency procedures." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that General Harrison was systematically building a case based on her medical capabilities, her responses to his questions, and whatever other information he had gathered about her background. She could feel the walls of her carefully constructed civilian identity beginning to crumble under his persistent investigation. "I completed additional trauma training during my residency," Sarah answered, which was technically true, though it omitted the context of where and why she had acquired such specialized skills. Urban emergency medicine requires expertise in treating severe injuries under challenging conditions. General Harrison's phone buzzed with what appeared to be an urgent message. He read it quickly, his expression shifting to something that combined satisfaction with grave concern. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice taking on the formal tone of official military business, "I'm going to need you to come with me for a confidential discussion about matters related to national security." The words sent a chill through Sarah's entire body as she realized that whatever information General Harrison had been seeking, he had apparently found it. Dr. Martinez looked confused by the sudden escalation from administrative courtesy to national security concerns, while other hospital staff within earshot began paying attention to the conversation. "I don't understand," Sarah said, though she understood perfectly well what was happening. "I'm a civilian physician with no connection to national security matters. I think there's been some kind of mistake." General Harrison reached into his jacket and produced a leather folder containing what appeared to be official identification and authorization documents. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to accompany me to a secure location where we can discuss your involvement in classified operations that officially never existed." His voice carried the weight of legal authority, backed by federal law. Sarah's hands began to tremble as 7 years of careful anonymity collapsed in the space of a single sentence. The secret she had guarded so carefully, the past she had worked so desperately to escape, had finally caught up with her in the most public and devastating way possible. Around them, the normal activity of the emergency department continued. But Sarah felt as though she was standing in a bubble of silence where her old life and new life were colliding with explosive force. The secure conference room at Fort Mitchell was sterile and windowless, designed to prevent any electronic surveillance or unauthorized recording of sensitive conversations. Sarah sat across from General Harrison at a metal table, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking as she waited for questions that could destroy everything she had built over the past 7 years. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows that reminded her of interrogation rooms in places she had tried desperately to forget. General Harrison opened a thick manila folder, marked with classification stamps and security warnings, spreading several photographs across the table. Between them, Sarah's breath caught as she recognized images from Operation Nightingale, surveillance photos of safe houses in Beirut, satellite imagery of target locations, and personnel files of team members she had once known by code names rather than real identities. These photographs were taken in September 2016. Harrison began, his voice carefully controlled and professional. They document the final known activities of a classified intelligence operation that was terminated when enemy operatives bombed the teen's primary safe house. He pointed to one image showing a building reduced to rubble and twisted metal. Official records indicate that all personnel assigned to Operation Nightingale were killed in that attack. Sarah stared at the photograph of the destroyed building, where she had lived and worked for 8 months, gathering intelligence on terrorist networks that were targeting American interests throughout the Middle East. She could still remember the smell of smoke and concrete dust, the sound of sirens in the distance, and the terrible certainty that everyone she had worked with was dead. Official records, she said quietly, are sometimes incomplete. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, abandoning the safety of denial for the dangerous territory of partial truth. She had spent so many years claiming ignorance that speaking about classified operations felt like using a language she had almost forgotten. General Harrison nodded slowly, pulling out another set of documents. Dr. Sarah Chen, emergency physician. At Mercy General Hospital, he read from what appeared to be a personnel file. Born Sarah Elena Morrison in Portland, Oregon. Graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown University with degrees in international relations and Middle Eastern studies. Fluent in Arabic, Farsi, and Kurdish. Sarah's stomach dropped as she heard her real name spoken aloud for the first time. In years, she had legally changed it twice, first when she entered intelligence work, then again when she created her civilian identity. But hearing Sarah Elena Morrison in the sterile military conference room brought back memories of family, dinners and college graduation ceremonies that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. After graduation, Harrison continued, you were recruited by the Defense Intelligence Agency for specialized operations, requiring cultural knowledge and language skills in Middle Eastern theaters of operation. He turned to another page. Your training included advanced field medicine, combat casualty care, and emergency surgical procedures, skills that were demonstrated quite effectively at this morning's accident scene. The general spread out more photographs, these showing Sarah in civilian clothes at various locations throughout Beirut and Damascus. Her hair had been different then, darker and longer, and she had been careful to dress in ways that would help her blend into local populations. Looking at those images now felt surreal, like viewing evidence of someone else's secret life. Agent Morrison, or should I say Dr. Chen, was embedded with humanitarian organizations operating in conflict zones. Harrison explained, though he was clearly stating information for the record rather than revealing anything Sarah didn't already know. Her medical credentials provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering in areas where traditional military operations would have been impossible. Sarah looked up from the photographs to meet Harrison's gaze directly. Why are you showing me this? She asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. If you know who I am and what I did, then you also know that I'm supposed to be dead. The bombing killed everyone. Not everyone, Harrison replied, opening another folder that contained documents she had never seen before. We recovered fragments of intelligence reports from the safe house debris, including communications that were sent after the bombing occurred. Someone survived long enough to transmit final operational data and coordinate the extraction of assets who were still in the field. The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of military vehicles moving around the base outside. Sarah stared at the evidence of her own survival, remembering the desperate hours she had spent in the rubble of the safe house, using emergency communication equipment to warn other operatives and evacuate local contacts who would have been killed if the terrorist network had identified them. I was buried under debris for 14 hours, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. When I got out, the rescue teams had already come and gone. Everyone was listed as dead, and I thought it would be safer for ongoing operations if I stayed dead. The explanation sounded inadequate even to her own ears, but it was the truth. About why she had chosen disappearance over official extraction, General Harrison leaned forward, his expression intense but not hostile. "Agent Morrison, you need to understand something about the intelligence you transmitted during those final hours. The terrorist network you had been monitoring was planning a series of coordinated attacks on American diplomatic facilities throughout the region. Your warning prevented what could have been the worst intelligence disaster since 9/11. Sarah felt a strange mixture of pride and regret as she heard about the broader impact of her actions. During those terrifying hours in the destroyed safe house, she had been focused entirely on immediate survival and protecting the people she could still reach. She had never known whether her final transmissions had reached their intended recipients or prevented any larger catastrophe. The attacks were scheduled for October 12, 2016. Harrison continued, showing her classified briefing documents that detailed the preventive operations. Coordinated bombings at embassies in Cairo, Amman, and Istanbul that would have killed hundreds of American personnel and local civilians. Your intelligence allowed us to quietly evacuate target locations and arrest key operatives before they could execute their plan. The weight of that information settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. She had spent 7 years believing that her survival and subsequent disappearance had been purely selfish, an act of cowardice disguised as operational security. Learning that her actions had prevented massive loss of life changed how she viewed her own choices during those desperate final hours. "If my intelligence was so valuable," she asked, "why wasn't I officially extracted? Why was I left to disappear and create a new identity?" The question had haunted her for years, the sense that she had been abandoned by the same government she had served faithfully even at the cost of her own supposed death. General Harrison's expression grew uncomfortable, and he consulted another document before answering. "Agent Morrison, you were officially declared dead because we believed you were dead. The intelligence transmissions were attributed to automated systems and delayed communications from other operatives. It wasn't until 18 months later that analysis of the transmission patterns and content suggested that someone had survived the bombing and stayed operational for an extended period." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had chosen to disappear because she thought it was operationally necessary, but the intelligence community had never even realized she was alive to be extracted. Her carefully calculated decision to remain dead had been based on assumptions about surveillance and security that turned out to be completely wrong. "By the time we realized what had happened," Harrison continued, "our efforts to locate you had been unsuccessful. You had created an effective civilian identity and seemed to have successfully transitioned out of intelligence work. The decision was made to leave you in place rather than potentially compromise your new life or expose details about Operation Nightingale." Sarah laughed bitterly at the irony of the situation. "So I've been hiding from people who weren't looking. For me, protecting secrets that were already considered compromised, and living in fear of discovery by an organization that had written me off as a casualty." The absurdity of her situation would have been funny if it hadn't cost her 7 years of isolation and constant anxiety. "That's an accurate summary," Harrison admitted. "Though I should point out that your decision to maintain operational security was correct even if your assumptions about official interest were wrong. There were still hostile actors looking for surviving Nightingale personnel, and your disappearance protected you from retaliation." The general gathered the photographs and documents spread across the table, organizing them back into their respective folders. "Agent Morrison, the reason I'm here today isn't to arrest you or compromise your civilian life. It's to offer you an opportunity to return to service in a capacity that utilizes your unique experience and expertise." Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized this conversation was heading toward an outcome she had never anticipated. "Return to service?" she repeated. "General, I've been officially dead for 7 years. I have a medical practice colleagues who respect me and a life that doesn't involve classified operations or the constant threat of violent retaliation. "I understand your reluctance," Harrison replied, "but there are situations developing in the Middle East that require exactly your combination of medical expertise, cultural knowledge, and operational experience. Situations where someone with your background could save lives and prevent the kind of attacks you helped stop 7 years ago." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge, forcing Sarah to confront the possibility that her carefully constructed civilian life might be interrupted by a return to the world she had worked so hard to escape. The weight of General Harrison's offer settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket as she struggled to process the implications of returning to a life she thought she had permanently left behind. The sterile conference room felt smaller now, filled with the ghosts of decisions that had shaped 7 years of careful anonymity and the prospect of choices that could reshape everything once again. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I'm not the same person who worked Operation Nightingale. I've spent 7 years learning to be a civilian, building relationships with colleagues who trust me, developing medical skills that have nothing to do with intelligence gathering or classified operations." General Harrison opened a different folder, this one containing contemporary intelligence briefings and threat assessments that looked far more current than the historical documents they had been discussing. "The situation is this," he began, spreading out satellite images of refugee camps and medical facilities in Syria and Jordan. "We have intelligence indicating that terrorist networks are planning to infiltrate humanitarian medical operations in the region." Sarah studied the photographs, recognizing the kinds of field hospitals and refugee treatment centers where she had worked during her intelligence career. The images showed sprawling camps filled with displaced families, makeshift medical facilities staffed by international aid organizations, and the organized chaos of humanitarian operations trying to provide care under impossible circumstances. "These medical facilities are perfect cover for terrorist infiltration," Harrison continued, pointing to specific locations on the satellite imagery. "Legitimate aid workers have access to refugee populations, freedom of movement across borders, and minimal security screening. A small number of operatives embedded within humanitarian organizations could cause devastating damage." The strategic analysis was sound, and Sarah could immediately see the vulnerabilities that Harrison was describing. Medical missions operated on trust and humanitarian principles that made them inherently unsuited for detecting sophisticated intelligence operations. She had exploited similar weaknesses herself during Operation Nightingale, using her medical credentials to access locations and populations that would have been impossible to reach through traditional military channels. "The problem," Harrison explained, "is that we need someone with legitimate medical credentials and operational experience to identify these infiltration attempts before they can be executed. Someone who understands both the humanitarian medical community and the intelligence gathering techniques that hostile actors might employ." Sarah felt the familiar pull of operational thinking, the mental process of analyzing threats and developing countermeasures that had once been as natural as breathing. "You want me to go back into the field," she said, "using medical cover to identify terrorist operatives who are using the same kind of medical cover I once used." "Precisely," Harrison confirmed. "Your emergency medicine training gives you legitimate expertise that aid organizations desperately need. Your intelligence background allows you to recognize operational patterns that civilian medical personnel would never notice. And your previous experience in the region provides cultural knowledge and language skills that would take years for other operatives to develop." The proposal was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Sarah would be returning to the exact kind of work that had nearly gotten her killed, operating in regions where her former enemies might still be looking for surviving. Nightingale personnel, using skills that she had spent 7 years trying to forget. "What about my life here?" she asked, gesturing in the general direction of Mercy General Hospital and the civilian existence she had constructed. "I have responsibilities to patients, colleagues who depend on me, and a medical practice that I've worked years to establish. I can't just disappear without consequences." General Harrison consulted his notes before responding. "Your deployment would be structured as a legitimate humanitarian assignment," he explained. "Doctors Without Borders and several other international medical organizations are actively recruiting emergency physicians for field assignments in refugee camps. Your hospital would view it as a prestigious international posting that reflects well on their staff." The cover story was believable, Sarah admitted to herself. Many emergency physicians took sabbaticals for humanitarian work, and her colleagues would likely view such an assignment as admirable rather than suspicious. Dr. Martinez had mentioned multiple times that her trauma skills were exceptional enough for international medical missions. "How long?" she asked, though part of her already knew she was beginning to consider the possibility seriously. "And what happens when the assignment ends? Do I come back to my civilian life, or does this become permanent?" "Initial deployment would be 6 months, Harrison replied. "Long enough to assess the threat level and identify any hostile operatives, but short enough to maintain your civilian cover identity. After that, you would have the option to return to your medical practice or consider additional assignments based on operational needs and your personal preferences." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to visualize herself back in field conditions, where every decision carried life or death consequences and every relationship was potentially compromised by hidden agendas. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, offering a return to work that had once given her life meaning while threatening to destroy the peace she had worked so hard to achieve. "There's something else you should know," Harrison said, his tone becoming more personal. "The terrorist networks we're monitoring include several operatives who were involved in the original Operation Nightingale bombing. Intelligence suggests they believe at least one team member survived and are actively searching for any remaining personnel." The information sent a chill through Sarah's entire body. She had always known that surviving the bombing might have made her a target, but 7 years of quiet civilian life had gradually diminished her sense of immediate threat. Learning that hostile actors were still actively hunting for her changed the entire calculation about safety and risk. "So staying in my civilian life isn't actually safer," she said, understanding the implicit message. "If they're already looking for me, then remaining in one location with the established identity actually makes me more vulnerable than moving to a different operational environment." "That's correct," Harrison confirmed. "Your current identity is secure for now, but it's not invisible. A determined adversary with sufficient resources could eventually track down Dr. Sarah Chen if they knew to look for surviving Nightingale operatives. Taking an international medical assignment would actually provide better protection by changing your location and operational context." The strategic logic was undeniable, but Sarah found herself thinking about the personal relationship she had built at Mercy General Hospital. Dr. Martinez had become something approaching a friend, one of the few people in her civilian life who had earned her trust and respect. Leaving for 6 months would mean abandoning colleagues who depended on her expertise and patients who benefited from her care. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "This isn't the kind of decision I can make in a sterile conference room based on threat assessments and operational requirements. I need to consider what this means for the life I've built and the people who would be affected by my absence." General Harrison nodded, though his expression suggested he had hoped for a more immediate decision. "I understand your reluctance," he said, "but I should point out that the intelligence regarding terrorist infiltration of medical operations is time-sensitive. Every day we delay increases the risk that hostile operatives will successfully embed themselves in humanitarian organizations. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable, appealing to Sarah's sense of duty and her awareness that innocent people might die if she failed to act on information that could prevent attacks. It was the same kind of moral leverage that had originally convinced her to join intelligence operations, the knowledge that her unique combination of skills could save lives in ways that few other people could accomplish. "How much time do I have to decide?" she asked, knowing that prolonged deliberation would be interpreted as lack of commitment to the mission's objectives. 72 hours, Harrison replied. The humanitarian organizations are making personnel decisions for their next deployment cycle, and we need to submit your application if you're going to be considered for the assignment. He gathered his documents and stood to leave. "Agent Morrison, I want you to understand that this isn't just about completing a mission or preventing terrorist attacks." Sarah looked up at him, waiting for the rest of his statement. 7 years ago, you saved hundreds of lives by staying operational in impossible circumstances, Harrison continued. You demonstrated the kind of courage and dedication that makes the intelligence community work. The world is a better place because you chose to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. The general's words carried the weight of official recognition that Sarah had never received for her actions during Operation Nightingale. For 7 years, she had carried the secret of those final hours in Beirut, never knowing whether her desperate efforts to protect ongoing operations had accomplished anything meaningful. "Think about it," Harrison said as he reached the door. "And remember that some people are called to serve in ways that require extraordinary sacrifice. You've already proven you're one of those people." As the door closed behind him, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by the weight of a decision that would determine whether she continued building her civilian life or returned to the dangerous world of intelligence operations where her unique skills could once again make the difference between life and death for people she would never meet. The drive back to her apartment felt surreal as Sarah navigated familiar streets while her mind raced through the implications of General Harrison's offer. Every landmark that had once represented the security of her civilian life now seemed temporary, potentially about to be abandoned for a return to the world of classified operations and constant danger. The small coffee shop where baristas knew her order, the grocery store where she bought the same basic supplies each week, the quiet neighborhood where she had finally learned to sleep through the night without checking locks and escape routes. All of it might soon become part of a past she would have to leave behind once again. Her apartment building looked different when she pulled into the parking space she had occupied for 3 years, as though she was seeing it through the eyes of someone who might not return. The familiar brick facade and well-maintained landscaping that had once represented stability now felt like stage props in a life she had been temporarily borrowing rather than permanently building. Sarah climbed the stairs to her 3rd floor unit, her keys feeling heavier than usual as she unlocked the door and stepped into the space she had carefully constructed to feel like home. The living room was furnished with pieces she had chosen for comfort rather than style. A well-worn leather couch where she read medical journals, bookshelves filled with emergency medicine textbooks and the occasional novel, and photographs of colleagues from the hospital that represented the closest thing she had to family in her civilian life. The kitchen table where she ate simple meals and reviewed patient files was now covered with the documents General Harrison had given her to consider: threat assessments, mission parameters, and contact information for humanitarian organizations that might provide cover for her return to intelligence work. Looking at those classified folders spread across the surface where she normally reviewed medical charts felt like watching 2 incompatible worlds collide. Sarah poured herself a glass of wine and sat on her couch, staring at the documents while trying to process the emotional whiplash of having her carefully hidden past exposed and her secure future suddenly thrown into question. For 7 years, she had built her identity around being Dr. Sarah Chen, emergency physician and anonymous civilian. The prospect of returning to Agent Morrison, intelligence operative and weapon in the shadow war against terrorism, felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. Her phone rang, interrupting her brooding contemplation. Dr. Martinez's name appeared on the caller ID, and Sarah felt a stab of guilt as she realized how the day's events would affect her colleagues, who had no idea about the classified world that was pulling her back into its orbit. "Sarah, how are you holding up after this morning?" Roberto's voice carried genuine concern. "That was intense work at the accident scene. And then having that general interrogating you at the hospital must have been stressful. I wanted to make sure you're okay." The kindness in his voice made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. Roberto Martinez was one of the few people in her civilian life who had shown her unconditional professional respect and personal warmth without expecting anything in return. The thought of leaving him and their colleagues without explanation felt like betraying the trust she had never fully appreciated. "I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. General Harrison was just following up on the treatment of military personnel. Standard protocol, nothing to worry about. The lie came easily after years of practice, but it left a bitter taste that reminded her why she had grown to hate the deception required by intelligence work. "Good," Roberto replied, though his tone suggested he sensed something was troubling her. "Listen, I've been thinking about what happened today. The way you handled that compound fracture in field conditions, your assessment of shock symptoms, the precision of your emergency intervention, Sarah, that was exceptional work even by trauma surgery standards." Sarah closed her eyes, knowing where this conversation was heading, and dreading the irony of timing that was about to make Roberto's praise even more complicated. "I've been talking with Dr. Patterson about recommending you for the International Medical Mission Program," Roberto continued. "Doctors Without Borders is always looking for emergency physicians with your skill level, and after today's demonstration of your capabilities, I think you'd be perfect for their Middle East operations." The coincidence was so perfect that Sarah almost laughed at the cruel efficiency of circumstances that were aligning to make General Harrison's proposal seem inevitable. "International missions," she repeated, trying to keep her voice neutral. "That's quite a career change from hospital emergency medicine." "It would be," Roberto agreed. "But Sarah, you have skills that could save lives in places where advanced medical care isn't available. Refugee camps, disaster zones, conflict areas where people are dying from injuries that you could treat with your eyes closed. Don't you think that kind of work might be more fulfilling than treating minor emergencies and routine trauma cases?" The conversation felt like a script written by military intelligence to reinforce the psychological pressure of General Harrison's recruitment effort. Roberto's genuine enthusiasm for international humanitarian work was making the decision to return to classified operations seem not just patriotic but personally meaningful in ways that her current hospital work could never match. "I don't know," Sarah said carefully. "International medical missions can be dangerous, especially in conflict zones. There are security concerns, cultural challenges, and the kind of primitive working conditions that make emergency medicine much more difficult than hospital-based practice." "True," Roberto acknowledged, "but that's exactly why they need physicians with your capabilities. Most emergency doctors are trained for well-equipped hospital environments, with full support staff and unlimited resources. You've demonstrated the ability to work effectively under the worst possible conditions with minimal equipment and maximum pressure." Sarah felt the walls of her civilian life closing in as Roberto unknowingly articulated exactly the qualifications that made her valuable for intelligence operations disguised as humanitarian work. Her advanced trauma skills, her comfort with dangerous environments, and her ability to make life or death decisions under extreme pressure were precisely what General Harrison needed for his mission to identify Terrorist infiltration of medical aid organizations. Roberto, she said, hypothetically, if I were to consider something like that, what would happen to my position at Mercy General? Would the hospital hold my job if I took a 6-month international assignment? Absolutely, he replied without hesitation. The hospital administration would probably view it as prestigious recognition of our emergency department's capabilities. Having a staff physician selected for international humanitarian work reflects well on the entire program. He paused. Sarah, are you actually considering this? Because if you are, I'd be happy to help you research organizations and application processes. The offer was generous and completely innocent, but it felt like another piece of the elaborate trap that was forming around her decision. Roberto's willingness to help her pursue international medical work would make her cover story more believable while providing emotional support for a choice that was actually about returning to intelligence operations rather than humanitarian service. I'm just thinking about career options, Sarah said, which was technically true even if it omitted the classified context that was driving her consideration. After today's accident, I've been wondering if my skills might be better utilized in more challenging environments. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Roberto responded enthusiastically. Sarah, you're one of the most capable emergency physicians I've ever worked with, but I've always sensed that you're not fully challenged by routine hospital work. You have the kind of instincts and expertise that could make a real difference in places where advanced medical care isn't readily available. After ending the call with Roberto, Sarah sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the physical evidence of two incompatible lives that were demanding her choice. On one side were the medical textbooks, hospital ID badge, and comfortable routine of Dr. Sarah Chen, emergency physician and civilian. On the other side were classified documents outlining threats to international security and opportunities to prevent terrorist attacks that could kill hundreds of innocent people. The wine glass in her hand was empty, though she couldn't remember drinking it. Outside her window, the suburban neighborhood was settling into its evening routine of families returning from work, children playing in yards, and the kind of peaceful normalcy that she had once thought was reserved for other people. 7 years ago, she had sacrificed her official existence to protect operations that saved lives in ways the peaceful families outside her window would never know or understand. Now she was being asked to sacrifice the civilian existence she had built to return to that shadow world where her unique combination of medical expertise and operational experience could once again make the difference between successful terrorist attacks and prevented catastrophes. Sarah looked at the documents General Harrison had given her, focusing on the satellite images of refugee camps where legitimate medical aid workers were trying to save lives while hostile operatives might be infiltrating their operations to cause maximum damage. The thought of terrorists using humanitarian medical missions as cover for attacks felt like a personal violation of everything she believed about the purpose of emergency medicine. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Dr. Chen, this is General Harrison. I wanted to remind you that the application deadline for the Doctors Without Borders deployment is tomorrow evening. Please contact me if you have any questions about the assignment parameters or security arrangements. The message was professionally neutral, but Sarah understood the subtext. Time was running out for her to make a decision that would determine whether she continued building her safe, anonymous civilian life or return to the dangerous world of intelligence operations, where her skills could save lives in ways that few other people could accomplish. As she prepared for bed in the apartment that might soon become part of her past, Sarah realized that the choice before her wasn't really between safety and danger, or between civilian life and military service. It was between the person she had become and the person she had always been underneath the careful construction of her anonymous identity. The next morning brought an unusual sense of clarity that surprised Sarah as she went through the motions of her normal routine. Making coffee, reviewing patient files, and preparing for her shift at Mercy General Hospital felt different when viewed through the lens of potentially leaving it all behind within weeks. Every familiar action carried the weight of finality, as though she was saying goodbye to rituals that had anchored her civilian identity for 7 years. The drive to the hospital took her past the accident scene from the previous day, now cleared of debris and marked only by skid marks on the asphalt and some disturbed grass along the shoulder. Looking at the spot where her carefully guarded secret had been exposed by a moment of careless sleeve positioning, Sarah realized that yesterday's events had been inevitable. 7 years of hiding had always been temporary, a brief respite between the life she had lost and whatever came next. Dr. Martinez was waiting for her in the break room with an expression of barely contained excitement that immediately put Sarah on alert. "I've been doing research on international medical missions," he said without preamble, spreading several printed documents across the table between coffee cups and scattered medical journals. "The opportunities are incredible, and with your qualifications, you'd be a prime candidate for some of the most impactful programs." Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and guilt as she looked at the materials Roberto had compiled on her behalf. Doctors Without Borders deployment schedules, International Red Cross medical mission requirements, and detailed descriptions of field hospital operations in refugee camps throughout the Middle East. His enthusiasm was genuine and his research thorough, making her deception feel even more corrosive to their professional relationship. "This looks comprehensive," she said, scanning the documents while trying to maintain appropriate interest without seeming overly eager. "Some of these assignments are quite challenging. Primitive conditions, security risks, extended deployments in politically unstable regions. Exactly what makes them perfect for someone with your capabilities," Roberto replied. "Sarah, I've been thinking about yesterday's accident response, and I keep coming back to how naturally you handled those field conditions. Most emergency physicians would have struggled with the environmental challenges, but you seemed completely comfortable working without full hospital support systems. The observation was accurate but dangerous, highlighting exactly the kind of advanced field medicine training that General Harrison had identified as evidence of her intelligence background." Sarah needed to deflect Roberto's analysis while maintaining his enthusiastic support for international deployment that would provide perfect cover for her return to classified operations. "Emergency medicine training includes disaster response scenarios," she said carefully. "We practice treating casualties under adverse conditions as part of standard certification requirements." It was true but incomplete, omitting the specialized combat casualty care and tactical medicine training she had received during her intelligence career. Roberto nodded but continued studying her with the focused attention of a colleague who had begun to suspect there were layers to her background that she hadn't shared. "Have you given serious thought to pursuing this kind of work?" "Because I've been asking around, and several people mentioned that international medical organizations are specifically recruiting emergency physicians with trauma experience for Middle Eastern operations." The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, and Sarah wondered if General Harrison had somehow influenced the recruitment efforts that Roberto was describing. The intelligence community was skilled at manipulating civilian institutions to support operational objectives, and having legitimate medical organizations actively seeking her specific qualifications would make her cover story much more believable. "I'm considering it," Sarah admitted, which was honest even if her motivations were entirely different from what Roberto assumed. "The work would be challenging, but it might be more fulfilling than routine hospital emergency medicine." She paused, studying his expression. "What do you think about the personal risks? These deployments can be dangerous, especially for Americans working in regions with active anti-Western sentiment." "The risks are real," Roberto acknowledged, "but so is the potential impact. Sarah, you could literally save hundreds of lives in refugee camps where people are dying from treatable injuries simply because advanced medical care isn't available." His voice carried the passion of someone who genuinely believed in humanitarian service. Isn't that worth some personal risk? The question struck closer to home than Roberto could possibly know. Sarah had spent her intelligence career accepting extraordinary personal risk to prevent terrorist attacks and protect innocent civilians, though her motivations had been patriotic duty rather than humanitarian idealism. The prospect of returning to dangerous work for ostensibly humanitarian purposes felt like a way to reconcile her need for meaningful service with her desire to help people directly rather than through the abstract calculus of intelligence operations. "You're right," she said, making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "I think I'd like to explore these opportunities more seriously. Would you be willing to help me navigate the application process?" Roberto's face lit up with genuine pleasure at her decision. "Absolutely. I have contacts at several organizations, and I'd be happy to provide recommendations highlighting your emergency trauma capabilities." He gathered the documents into a neat stack. "How quickly are you thinking about pursuing this? Some programs have deployment cycles that start within months rather than years." "Soon," Sarah replied, thinking about General Harrison's 72-hour deadline and the urgency of preventing terrorist infiltration of medical aid operations. "I'm ready for a change, and it seems like the right time to take on more challenging work." She managed a smile that felt almost genuine. "Thank you for encouraging me to consider this. I don't think I would have had the courage to pursue international work without your support." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their first patient of the day, a construction worker with a dislocated shoulder that required immediate attention. As Sarah worked to relocate the joint and assess for additional injuries, she found herself viewing the familiar procedures through the lens of someone who might soon be performing similar work under primitive field conditions without access to hospital equipment and support staff. During her lunch break, Sarah drove to a secure location and called the number General Harrison had provided. The phone was answered on the first ring by a voice she didn't recognize, though the professional tone suggested military communication protocols. "This is Dr. Chen," she said, using the verbal identification code Harrison had given her. "I need to speak with General Harrison about the humanitarian assignment we discussed." "Please hold for secure transfer," the voice replied, followed by electronic sounds that indicated her call was being routed through encrypted channels designed to prevent unauthorized monitoring. The technology reminded her of communication systems she had used during Operation Nightingale, sophisticated equipment that allowed intelligence operatives to coordinate activities across multiple time zones and hostile territories. "Dr. Chen," General Harrison's voice came through clearly despite the encryption processing. "I was hoping to hear from you. Have you reached a decision about the deployment?" "Yes," Sarah said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded despite the magnitude of what she was committing to. "I'm willing to accept the assignment, with some conditions about maintaining my civilian medical credentials and ensuring that my hospital position remains available when the deployment ends." "Excellent," Harrison replied, and she could hear satisfaction in his tone. "Those conditions are completely acceptable and actually strengthen your operational cover. A physician who maintains ties to her civilian practice appears more legitimate to aid organizations and hostile surveillance alike." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and dread as she crossed the threshold from civilian life back into the world of classified operations, where every decision carried consequences she couldn't fully anticipate. "What happens next?" she asked. "How quickly does this process move forward?" "Your application to Doctors Without Borders will be expedited through channels that don't appear unusual to their recruitment staff," Harrison explained. "You'll receive interview requests within 48 hours, and assuming those go well, you could be deployed within 3 weeks." He paused. "Dr. Chen, I want you to understand that once this process begins, maintaining operational security becomes critical for your safety and the success of the mission. The reminder sent a chill through Sarah's chest as she realized that accepting this assignment meant returning to a world where casual conversations with colleagues like Roberto would require constant vigilance to avoid revealing classified information. 7 years of learning to be honest and straightforward in her civilian relationships would have to be abandoned in favor of the careful deception that intelligence work demanded. "I understand," she said, though understanding and accepting were different things entirely. "When do I receive detailed mission parameters and operational guidelines?" "Tonight," Harrison replied. "Someone will deliver additional materials to your apartment after 2,100 hours. Review everything carefully, but remember that those documents cannot leave your residence and must be destroyed, according to the included instructions." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her car outside the medical complex where she had worked for 3 years, watching colleagues and patients move through the familiar environment that would soon be part of her past. The decision was made, the process was beginning, and within weeks she would be back in the field as Agent Morrison rather than Dr. Chen. The transition felt both like coming home and jumping off a cliff into darkness. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the dusty courtyard of a refugee camp outside Azraq, Jordan, watching the organized chaos of a humanitarian medical operation that served as perfect cover for her return to intelligence work. The transition from suburban Michigan Emergency Department to Middle Eastern Field Hospital had been remarkably smooth, facilitated by the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that only occurred when classified operations were supporting legitimate humanitarian efforts. Her official credentials identified her as Dr. Sarah Chen, emergency physician on temporary assignment with Doctors Without Borders, specializing in trauma care for displaced populations fleeing regional conflicts. The cover story was so thoroughly documented that even she sometimes forgot the intelligence mission hidden beneath her legitimate medical duties. Roberto Martinez's enthusiastic recommendation had been supplemented by military connections that ensured her application received favorable consideration despite the accelerated timeline. The camp housed nearly 40,000 refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, creating exactly the kind of diverse, transient population that terrorist operatives might use for infiltration and recruitment activities. Sarah's medical tent was positioned strategically to observe movement patterns throughout the camp while providing genuine emergency care to people who desperately needed advanced trauma treatment. Dr. Amira Hassan, the camp's senior medical coordinator, had welcomed Sarah's arrival with the gratitude of someone overwhelmed by caseloads that exceeded available resources. "Your emergency medicine background is exactly what we need," Amira had explained during Sarah's first briefing. "We see everything from routine infections to complex surgical cases, often without the equipment or supplies that hospital-based physicians take for granted." The medical challenges were real and demanding, requiring Sarah to draw on both her civilian emergency medicine training and the specialized field medicine skills she had developed during her intelligence career. Yesterday's cases had included a child with severe dehydration, an elderly man with infected shrapnel wounds from ordnance explosions, and a pregnant woman experiencing complications that required improvisational surgical intervention under primitive conditions. What made the work particularly complex was her need to maintain constant awareness of the intelligence gathering mission while providing genuine medical care to patients who trusted her completely. Sarah found herself analyzing every interaction for potential security implications, while simultaneously focusing on clinical assessments that could mean the difference between life and death for vulnerable people who had already lost everything. Her intelligence objectives required documenting unusual behavior patterns, identifying individuals whose backgrounds didn't match their claimed refugee status, and monitoring communications that might indicate coordination with external networks. The challenge was conducting this surveillance without compromising her medical responsibilities, or raising suspicions among legitimate aid workers, who viewed the camp purely through humanitarian rather than security lenses. 3 days into her deployment, Sarah had identified several concerning patterns that warranted closer investigation. A group of young men who claimed to be Syrian refugees, but spoke Arabic with Pakistani accents that suggested different regional origins than they had reported to camp administrators. Medical supplies that were disappearing faster than patient treatment records could account for, indicating possible diversion for non-medical purposes. And communication equipment in the camp's administrative areas that appeared more sophisticated than what humanitarian organizations typically required for coordination with external agencies. The most troubling discovery had come during her second week, when she treated a patient with scarring patterns that suggested professional weapons training rather than the random injury profile typical of civilian refugees fleeing conflict zones. The man had claimed to be a farmer displaced by fighting in northern Syria, but his muscle development and callus formation indicated extensive experience with military equipment and tactical operations. Sarah had documented her observations using the encrypted communication system that General Harrison's team had established, disguised as routine medical reports to international health organizations. The intelligence flowed through channels that appeared completely legitimate, while providing military analysts with data needed to assess potential security threats within the refugee population. What she hadn't anticipated was how emotionally challenging it would be to view suffering people through the dual lens of medical compassion and intelligent suspicion. Every patient she treated was simultaneously someone who needed her help and a potential security threat who might be planning attacks against the same humanitarian workers who were trying to save lives. The moral complexity of the situation became particularly acute when she was asked to treat Halil Mansur, a middle-aged man who had been brought to the medical tent after collapsing during food distribution. His symptoms suggested severe malnutrition and dehydration, but his physical condition was inconsistent with the timeline he provided about fleeing Syria 3 months earlier. "Doctor," Halil said in heavily accented English as Sarah examined his cardiovascular responses, "I am grateful for your help. You Americans, you come here to help people like me when your own government could leave us to die." His gratitude seemed genuine, but something about his phrasing suggested more familiarity with American politics and foreign policy and would be typical for a displaced farmer. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor while conducting a thorough medical assessment, but she was simultaneously analyzing Halil's speech patterns, body language, and knowledge base for inconsistencies that might indicate deception about his background and intentions. The intelligence training that had once saved her life in Beirut was now helping her identify potential threats within a population of genuinely vulnerable refugees. "Rest is important for recovery," she told Halil as she prepared 4 fluids to address his dehydration. "How long were you without adequate food and water before reaching the camp?" The question was medically relevant, but also designed to elicit details about his journey that could be verified against other intelligence sources. Halil's response included geographical references that didn't align with the routes typically used by Syrian refugees, suggesting either confusion about his actual origins or deliberate misdirection about his travel history. Sarah made mental notes while maintaining the compassionate bedside manner that patients expected from humanitarian medical workers. That evening, in the privacy of her small housing unit within the aid worker compound, Sarah encrypted her observations about Halil and transmitted them through secure channels to military intelligence analysts who would cross-reference his information against databases of known operatives and suspected infiltrators. The process felt familiar from her previous intelligence work, but the humanitarian context made the surveillance feel more morally complicated than her previous assignments. Dr. Hassan knocked on Sarah's door just as she was completing her intelligence report. carrying tea, and the kind of exhausted expression that characterized aid workers, who had been dealing with refugee crises for years rather than weeks. "How are you adjusting to the work?" Amira asked, settling into the single chair that constituted Sarah's entire living room furniture. "It's challenging but rewarding," Sarah replied, which was honest despite omitting the classified aspects of her assignment. "The medical cases are more complex than I expected, and the resource limitations require creative problem-solving that you don't encounter in well-equipped hospital environments." She paused, studying Amira's expression. "Have you noticed any unusual patterns in patient presentations or camp population changes since I arrived?" Amira sipped her tea thoughtfully before responding. "There have been some irregularities," she admitted. "Medical supply usage that doesn't correlate with treatment records, patients whose backgrounds don't quite match their claimed origins, and communication activities that seem more sophisticated than what displaced refugee populations typically maintain." The admission surprised Sarah, who hadn't expected her fellow medical workers to notice the same security concerns that her intelligence training had highlighted. "What do you think explains those irregularities?" she asked carefully, trying to gauge how much Amira suspected about potential infiltration without revealing her own classified knowledge. "Honestly, I'm not sure," Amira said. "Part of me wants to assume innocent explanations, record-keeping errors, confusion about patient histories, normal variations in refugee population characteristics. But another part of me worries that we're seeing evidence of something more concerning." She looked directly at Sarah. "Have you observed anything that seems unusual?" The question put Sarah in an impossible position between her intelligence mission and her developing trust with a colleague who was genuinely committed to humanitarian service. Sharing her observations would potentially compromise operational security, but withholding them might prevent Amira from taking precautions that could protect legitimate aid workers from hostile infiltrators. "I've noticed some inconsistencies," Sarah said finally, choosing her words carefully. "Patient presentations that don't match reported histories, supply usage patterns that seem unusual, and individuals whose backgrounds may not be exactly what they've claimed." She paused. "What concerns me is that these irregularities could indicate security issues that might endanger aid workers." Amira nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I've been worried about. Sarah, there have been attacks on humanitarian operations in other refugee camps, situations where hostile actors infiltrated aid organizations to gather intelligence or position themselves for operations against international workers." Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen colleagues injured or killed because security threats weren't identified in time. The conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking on Sarah's door. A camp security officer was requesting immediate medical assistance for multiple casualties from what appeared to be a coordinated attack on the camp's administrative facilities. As Sarah grabbed her medical kit and rushed toward the emergency, she realized that the theoretical security threats they had been discussing were about to become devastatingly real. The intelligence mission that had brought her back to the Middle East was about to intersect with a genuine humanitarian crisis in ways that would test both her medical skills and her ability to protect innocent people while gathering classified information that might prevent future attacks. The administrative compound was in chaos when Sarah arrived, with smoke rising from the communications building and emergency lights casting eerie shadows across the damaged structures. 5 aid workers had been injured in what appeared to be a carefully coordinated attack that had simultaneously targeted the camp's communication systems, medical supply storage, and security coordination center. The precision and timing suggested operational planning that went far beyond opportunistic violence or random terrorism. Sarah immediately began triaging the wounded, her emergency medicine training taking over despite the obvious implications of what they were witnessing. Dr. Hassan had suffered a severe head injury when debris from an explosion knocked her unconscious, while 3 other international aid workers sustained lacerations and potential internal injuries from the blast. Effects. The 5th casualty was Ahmed Rashid, a camp translator who had been found near the communications building with gunshot wounds that suggested close-range execution rather than random violence. "This wasn't random," said Captain Morrison, the camp's security coordinator, as Sarah worked to stabilize Ahmed's critical injuries. "The attackers knew exactly where to strike for maximum operational impact, communications first, then medical supplies, then security infrastructure. This was planned by people with detailed knowledge of our facilities and procedures." Sarah continued applying pressure to Ahmed's wounds while processing the tactical implications of what Morrison was describing. The attack pattern indicated intelligence gathering and operational planning that required either inside information or extensive surveillance of the camp's activities. Combined with the security irregularities she had been documenting, the evidence was building toward confirmation of terrorist infiltration at the highest levels of the camp's operations. "Ahmed," she said quietly as the translator regained consciousness, "can you tell me what happened? Who did this to you?" The question was medically appropriate for assessing cognitive function, but Sarah was also hoping to gather intelligence about the attackers before his condition deteriorated further. "They knew," Ahmed whispered, his voice weak but urgent. "The men who shot me, they knew about the security reports, the communication schedules, the supply delivery protocols. Someone had given them detailed information about our operations." He struggled to focus on Sarah's face. "Doctor," one of them spoke about the American medical woman who asks too many questions. "I think they know about you." The revelation sent a chill through Sarah's entire body as she realized that her intelligence mission had been compromised, and she was now a specific target for hostile operatives who understood exactly why she was in the camp. The careful cover story that had protected her for 3 weeks had apparently been penetrated by the same network she had been trying to identify and disrupt. "Captain." Morrison overheard Ahmed's warning and immediately began implementing emergency security protocols while Sarah continued treating the wounded. "Dr. Chen, you need to understand that this changes everything," he said, speaking rapidly into his radio while coordinating evacuation procedures. "If they know about your intelligence activities, then staying in the camp puts both you and every legitimate aid worker at risk." Sarah felt the familiar weight of decisions that would determine whether people lived or died. But this time the stakes included her own survival and the safety of colleagues who had trusted her humanitarian credentials. The injured aid workers needed immediate medical attention that she was uniquely qualified to provide, but remaining in the camp to treat them could expose everyone to additional attacks aimed specifically at her elimination. "We need to evacuate the critical casualties to a proper medical facility," she told Morrison while preparing 4 lines for the most seriously injured patients. "Dr. Hassan needs neurosurgical consultation within hours, and Ahmed requires surgical intervention that can't be performed under field conditions." She paused, calculating distances and transportation logistics. "The nearest appropriate facility is the International Medical Center in Amman, approximately 2 hours by road convoy." Morrison consulted his communication equipment, coordinating with external security forces while managing the immediate crisis within the camp. "Emergency medical evacuation is being arranged," he reported, "but the convoy will be vulnerable to attack during transport. Intelligence suggests that hostile operatives may have positioned assets along the evacuation routes, specifically to intercept high-value targets." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah found herself making the kind of life-or-death calculations that had characterized her previous intelligence career. Evacuating with the wounded would provide them with the best chance of survival, but would also create a concentrated target for enemies who were specifically hunting her. Remaining in the camp would protect the evacuation, convoy but would leave critically injured colleagues without the advanced medical care they needed. Her encrypted communication device buzzed with an urgent message from General Harrison's intelligence team. Dr. Chen, intelligence indicates imminent follow-up attacks on refugee camp. Immediate extraction recommended. Operational security compromised at highest levels. Respond with status and evacuation preferences. Sarah looked around the damaged administrative compound where legitimate humanitarian workers were bleeding from injuries sustained because her classified mission had apparently drawn terrorist attention to their peaceful operations. The moral weight of responsibility felt heavier than any decision she had made during Operation Nightingale, when her choices had affected military personnel who understood the risks they were accepting. "Captain Morrison," she said, making a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. "I'm going to accompany the medical evacuation to ensure that our casualties receive appropriate care during transport. If hostile operatives are targeting me specifically, then removing me from the camp should reduce the threat level for remaining aid workers." Morrison nodded grimly. "That's probably the best option for everyone's safety," he agreed. "But Dr. Chen, you need to understand that leaving the camp doesn't end your exposure to these threats. The networks that identified you here have demonstrated sophisticated intelligence capabilities that will allow them to track your movements, regardless of location." The evacuation convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles provided by Jordanian military forces, with Sarah and the wounded aid workers in the center vehicle surrounded by security escorts. As they departed the refugee camp, Sarah watched through bulletproof windows as the humanitarian operation she had been protecting continued its work of caring for thousands of displaced people who had already lost everything. Dr. Hassan remained unconscious during the transport, her head injury requiring constant monitoring for signs of increased intracranial pressure that could cause permanent brain damage or death. Ahmed's gunshot wounds had been temporarily stabilized, but he was losing blood faster than 4 fluids could replace it, making the race to reach surgical facilities a matter of minutes rather than hours. "Doctor," Ahmed said during one of his brief conscious periods, "the men who attacked us, they mentioned other camps, other operations. This wasn't just about stopping your intelligence work. Here, they're planning something much larger." His voice was getting weaker, but his message was clear enough to send urgent warnings through Sarah's encrypted communication channels. The convoy was 20 minutes from Amman when the first attack came, an improvised explosive device that destroyed the lead vehicle and sent the medical transport careening off the road into a roadside ditch. Sarah found herself once again in the position of providing emergency medical care under combat conditions, treating blast injuries while hostile forces prepared for a coordinated assault designed to eliminate both her and any witnesses to their operations. As gunfire erupted around the overturned medical vehicle, Sarah realized that her return to intelligence work had led exactly where she had always known it would, to a situation where her unique combination of medical expertise and operational training was the only thing standing between innocent people and death at the hands of terrorists who viewed humanitarian workers as legitimate targets in their war against civilization. The woman who had spent 7 years building a quiet, anonymous life as Dr. Sarah Chen was gone, replaced once again by Agent Morrison, intelligence operative trained to keep people alive when everything else was falling apart. Ahmed and Dr. Hassan needed her medical skills to survive their injuries, while the convoy's security team needed her tactical knowledge to coordinate an effective defense against attackers who had been planning this operation for weeks. Sarah checked her sidearm, standard issue for intelligence operatives working in hostile territories, and began organizing the defense of wounded colleagues who had trusted her humanitarian credentials, without knowing that their lives would be endangered by her classified mission to protect them from the very threats that were now trying to kill them all. The quiet life she had built in Michigan felt like someone Elsa's dream as she prepared to fight for the survival of people who deserved better than to be caught in the crossfire of intelligence operations they had never signed up for. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the International Conference on Humanitarian Security, no longer hiding behind the careful anonymity that had defined her civilian years. The attack in Jordan had ended with her successfully defending the medical convoy until military reinforcements arrived, saving Dr. Hassan and Ahmed while eliminating the terrorist cell that had infiltrated the refugee camp. The line between humanitarian service and intelligence work isn't always clear, she told the audience of aid workers, military officials, and policymakers. Sometimes protecting innocent people requires skills that go beyond medical training or traditional peacekeeping. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to navigate both worlds without compromising either mission. General Harrison sat in the front row, having facilitated Sarah's transition to a new role as Director of Security Integration for International Medical Operations. Her official position allowed her to train humanitarian workers in threat recognition, while maintaining the intelligence capabilities that had prevented countless attacks on refugee populations across 3 continents. Dr. Martinez had flown in from Michigan for her presentation, finally understanding why his colleague had possessed such extraordinary trauma skills. "I always knew there was more to your story," he said afterward, embracing her with the warmth of friendship that had survived the revelation of classified truths. Sarah's apartment in Washington, D.C. was larger than her Michigan home, filled with commendations from humanitarian organizations and intelligence agencies that had learned to work together because people like her proved it was possible. The quiet anonymity she had once craved had been replaced by purposeful visibility as someone who refused to choose between saving lives and protecting national security. The woman who had once fixed radiator hoses in military parking lots had become someone whose name was spoken with respect in both medical conferences and classified briefings. Proof that heroes sometimes hide in plain sight until the world needs them to step forward. What did you think of Sarah's incredible journey from hidden spy to celebrated hero? Stories like these remind us that extraordinary people walk among us every day, often disguised as ordinary civilians. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and join our community of viewers who believe in the power of hidden heroes. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever suspected someone in your life might have a secret, heroic past? Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our inspiring true stories of courage, sacrifice, and the amazing people who choose to serve others even when no one is watching.